I'm really grateful, David, to be here, and thank you for inviting us. As a West London MP as well, I'm really excited about what you're doing at White City. I think it's a tremendous initiative. But what an inspiring place it is to speak about the future of the economy and the world of work at the college's new incubator, with the startups and entrepreneurs working alongside each other with the leading minds in science. My own experience in work was with the technological revolution of the time, which was televisions. I worked for Philips on the shop floor. I was a production worker manufacturing 28-inch televisions at the time. My job was to take the television screen with the dots and seal them with an ultraviolet light on a machine. My job title was exposer. Try and travel abroad with that on your passport. It can be difficult. But on the shop floor, I did my A-levels back at night school at the local tech college. And then I went on after that to Brunel University with a sandwich course at the time. And looking back on it then, I just think of the possibilities that were open to us, my generation. There were skilled jobs available for the millions, who, like me, didn't go straight from university. There was generous access to courses at local FE colleges, and there was free education as well for those who did go to university. On modest means, a young person could then buy a house. After all the advances we've made, why is it now that so many things we took for granted back then are no longer available for our children's generation? Wages for the under 30s have been decimated since the financial crisis and are still 10% below their 2010 level. Home ownership in many parts of the country is out of reach of the millions whose parents are unable to help with a deposit. And social housing now is a distant memory in many areas, and the insecurity of private renting means upheaval and uncertainty for a majority. How did this come about? How can it be, with all the productive and creative advances of the last few decades, that in some of the most important aspects of life, my grandchildren have a less secure life to look forward to than mine? John Maynard Keynes famously predicted in the 1930s that these expanding capacities would lead to a 15-hour working week, and the rest of the time filled with leisure activities rather than worrying about how to find more money. For today's young people, more than any other generation since, his dream could not seem further from coming true. This is the backdrop to Jeremy Corbyn's election campaign only a few months ago, where large numbers of young people saw that campaign as giving them the prospect of new hope. Jeremy was elected leader of the Labour Party by an overwhelming majority of members and supporters on the basis of a programme that rested on three pillars. First, a new politics, the creation of a more democratic, engaging and kinder politics in both the Labour Party and society. We're getting there on the kinder bit. Second, a new economics, laying the economic foundations of a prosperous, fairer and sustainable society. And third, a new relationship with the world based upon a foreign policy promoting mutual cooperation, conflict prevention and resolution rather than military aggression. The good society that I think most of us envisage is one that's free, democratic, prosperous, environmentally sustainable, safe and secure, based upon the values of fairness, equality and social justice, where everybody has the ability to develop their talents and enjoyment of life to the full. Austerity provides us with none of this. Worse, it moves us further and further away from that vision. The impact is felt by the poorest and the most vulnerable. Just one example amongst the many. The number of those sleeping rough has risen by a shocking 55% since 2010. In the sixth richest country in the world, that anybody should be without a roof over their heads is a disgrace. And there is worse to come. Unless reversed by the Chancellor under public pressure, tax credit cuts threaten over 3 million households with losing £1,300 a year. These raw figures hide the real stories of huge suffering and personal tragedies now being borne out across the country. Yet, none of this suffering is necessary. Austerity, as I argued in September and have continued to argue since, is a straight political choice. There's no economic necessity behind it. There's a broad consensus from the IMF and across the economic profession against it now. Austerity is a political choice, it's not an economic necessity. It threatens our future economic security. It is, however, for George Osborne and the Conservatives, to be frank, the easy option. Since the late 1970s, governments across the world have promoted gains for the few in the belief that the many would eventually share. Capital markets were liberalised and taxes cut, but under successive governments, inequality rose. It was not trickle down, but trickle up. It's time to change the rules of the game. Neoliberalism, the current rule book, has outlived its time. The old rules are failing the majority, and they will not cope with the changes that are ahead of us. My real concern is for the long-term well-being of our economy. If we're to thrive as an economy, we have to base our future on the rapidly developing new technologies. If this building doesn't tell us that, nothing will. It's what many are calling the new machine age. Miss this boat and we'll struggle to keep up in a competitive global marketplace. We will have a country divided geographically between the finance sector of the City of London, surrounded by a sea of low-paid service sector jobs, and an industrial wasteland in the rest of the country. In many areas, the pace of industrial decline will continue to destroy lives and devastate communities. If this sounds dystopian, take a trip like I did to Teesside and see what the loss of steel, of potash mining, and the loss of 300 HMRC jobs can do to threaten the life of a community. Technological advance is forcing the pace of change. Bank of England research suggests that 15 million jobs could have risk of automation over the next decade or so. And those most at risk from automation are the lowest paid. For those who own the robots, of course, it will be a different story. Wealth will flow faster into fewer hands. A minority will continue to profit immensely. But there is a different way, we believe. First, we need a government to understand and accept the strategic role it has to play in our new economy. The current government is blocking the path to our future. They're willfully blind to the changes taking place. They privilege vested interests and old ways of working. Our giant corporations are enjoying a boom time, taking their biggest ever slice of our national income as profits. Some of the most powerful institutions in the land appear to act almost unhindered. Think about how little has been done to get even our publicly owned banks to clean up their act since the crash. And so many of our underlying problems can be traced back to the domination of a few powerful institutions that have failed over many years to act in the public interest. And yet we have a government all but captured by vested interests. Corporation tax, already the lowest in the G7, has been cut again and cut heading towards just 18%. Feather bedding takes place through a wild, complex system of tax reliefs and now comes up to 110 billion a year. Cutting HMRC while turning a blind eye to rampant tax avoidance and tax evasion, running into billions at the moment. And whilst large corporations are treated with kid gloves, those who work are treated with the iron fist. We already have the most repressive trade union laws in Western Europe. The trade union bill that's now before Parliament will tighten the screw even further. Let me say this, Labour will oppose the trade union bill at every step of the way, and should it become law, we will repeal it when we go back into government. Unlike France or Germany in the UK, rights of workers to speak up for themselves in their own companies are limited in the extreme. No formal provision exists for workers who have a say in decisions that affect not only their lives, but potentially those of their customers. We are throwing away the chance for those who work to bring their skills, talent, and in-depth knowledge into how our corporations make decisions. Democracy isn't just a political question, it's a bread and butter issue. A new contract for the workplace means securing a better balance between those who work and those who employ. So we will open up a review on the workplace representation, drawing on the best practices from around the world to unlock democracy in our workplaces and release its creative potential. We will seek to break open also the monopolies and oligopolies that dominate our essential industries, offering extended support to those seeking to set up cooperative and community ownership of their own companies and assets. Meeting the challenges of the future requires a state that can think and act strategically. A new economics can start to provide an alternative. We need to think about how government can operate on the basis not only of providing necessary public services, but also to meet the challenges of the future. That's why we've launched reviews of the mandate of the Bank of England and the Treasury's function to report on how they can operate in the best interests of society. This is just the first step in a process that will see us work with businesses, entrepreneurs, scientists, trade unions, universities, and wider society to shape the economy of our future. We know this can be done. Finland met its disastrous recession in the 1990s by transforming its economy from an exporter of lumber to an exporter of technology. At the centre of its transition, it established the Science and Technology Policy Council, chaired by the Prime Minister, drawing on expertise from across business, science, universities and civil society. Labour and government will bring business, unions, scientists, universities together in a new innovation policy strategy with a mission-led goal to boost research and development spending and maximise the social and economic benefits from that expenditure. We already have brilliant entrepreneurs. I met Dale Vince, who started the world's first green energy company, Ecotricity, from a caravan in Gloucestershire. Dale used to be a New Age traveller, well I think he still is at times. Ecotricity now supplies 75,300 homes with renewable energy, and in 2014 had a turnover of £66 billion. We need more creativity like this, thousands of new businesses being created. We want government to work with, not against those entrepreneurs, helping creating wealth in society. But rather than investing for the future, I have to say, George Osborne has overseen a slump in government funding for vital infrastructure. As a share of GDP, public infrastructure spending has fallen from 3.3% in the final year of the last Labour government to 1.6% today. It's scheduled to fall still further under the Red Book to 1.4%. Meanwhile, our major corporations, despite record profits, are sitting on vast cash piles. At least £400 billion now is held in corporate bank accounts, money that should be invested. This is a part of a pattern that was identified by Martin Wolf last week in the Financial Times of slumping investment relative to cash flow across major economies. That slide has been amongst the worst in the UK, stretching back beyond the crash to the early 2000s. Meanwhile, dividend payments are at an all-time high. So we have a government that won't invest, corporations that won't invest, and a damaging cycle set up for generations ahead of failure. The consequences of this failure are all too apparent. Underpaid and overworked staff, insecurity, businesses unable to compete. Basic utilities also under threat. The national grid has warned of electricity shortage this winter. This is in Britain in 2015, the sixth richest economy in the world. Clearly some of this has got back to George Osborne, and in a state of panic he's been running around China trying to drum up funding. He opposes nationalisation except when it's the Chinese or the French state or elsewhere. Short-termism and antipathy to the state dominates every decision. The OECD thinks that as a minimum, a developed country like Britain should be spending 3.5% of GDP on infrastructure. Labour in power will meet and exceed that commitment, reversing decades of underspend. This should include renewable energy, energy efficiency, major public transport improvements and ultra-high-speed broadband. Labour understands that the government's role is to provide the opportunity for massive advances in technology, skills and organisational change. The Labour government would provide provision of patient, long-term finance for investment in research to support the technology that will drive further innovation in our economy. And we would look at changes in our corporate tax system to give companies incentives to invest wisely. A higher tax on retained earnings should be investigated as well, alongside providing deductibility for long-term investment. The City of London and our financial institutions can also play their part. Labour will seek a new compact with the financial services, looking for guarantees on stable long-term domestic investment, mobilising their skills and resources for the wider public benefit. I'm hoping to meet with Mark Brolly from the Corporation of London later this month to discuss the ways in which the City and Finance can play their part in a new contract for Britain. I also say we will retain, of course, the right to legislate if necessary. But it's science and technology and innovation that's shaping our new world. That's what the Imperial College is showing us. Britain has an extraordinary and proud legacy of scientific research, of which this institution is a significant part. It's still a world leader today in the quality of its research. But rather than build on this heritage, I have to say across our economy we're strip mining it. Despite promising to protect research funding, this has been neglected. Current expenditure on research and development has fallen by £1 billion in real terms since 2010. And this is having results. For example, the UK's cutting-edge neutron source at Harwell is running 120 days a year, only running for 120 days a year due to funding shortages, and leading scientists say we are facing irreversible declines in particle physics, astrophysics and nuclear physics. Britain spends less on research as a share of GDP than France, Germany, the US and China, all of whom are increasing their commitment to science and technology. We spend less than 0.5% of GDP on science, and that's set to reduce even further. The UK has no long-term plan to increase the R&D spending. Modern breakthroughs in research are the result of past investment by government built on the foundations of an immense scientific and technical heritage. However, in science and technology and innovation, we're beginning to live off past glories. We can and should do better. The Royal Society recommends a target of meeting at least the OECD average spend on research and development by 2020. Let me say this now, a Labour government will exceed this with total spending from both public and private sources of at least 3% of GDP by 2030, and we hope to go beyond. We'll also extend Labour's 10-year framework to cover the next decade and increase innovation support, ring-fencing this spending. The current Chancellor may be trying to close the fiscal deficit, but by failing to invest, he's opening up a massive deficit with the future. We believe that any fiscal rule should ensure government's current spending is brought into a sensible balance, consistent with sensible economic growth, but whilst allowing investment to continue. Another priority will be to ensure that our provision of skills is adequate to the needs of the new economy we wish to create. At present, employer after employer is reporting dire skill shortages. Further education colleges, a vital linchpin of the education system, are now threatened with swingeing cuts. If every person is to have the opportunity to share in the prosperity that the new economy can offer, every person must have the opportunity to learn, develop and fulfil their potential throughout life. Secure foundations for the new economy mean prosperity across the whole country. The widening of the gap between our richest places and the rest is clearly excessive. Average weekly pay now in North East Derbyshire is £389 a week, while in the City of London it's £921. Government's response to this regional disparity has been persistently inadequate. Planned infrastructure spending per person in the north of England is 1/5 of its level in London. We won't get a northern powerhouse unless government is prepared to pay for it. Improved transport, greater autonomy in taxation and spending decisions and powers to borrow will enable our regional authorities to meet their huge potential. But of course we cannot allow government to strip local councils to the bone. Labour will continue to oppose the devastating cuts being made to local authority funding, particularly in this CSR round. Local authorities can and should be the local engines of sustainable long-term prosperity. How we work is changing as well. Shifts in technology are opening up new possibilities. The spread of information technology in particular, the long-term decline in the cost of computing power has created opportunities that simply did not exist before. Airbnb, for example, simply could not have existed before the internet. It does not own or rent rooms itself. It provides a space through which others can do so. Sometimes this has been labelled the gig economy. Its enthusiasts talk up the possibilities for more exciting, more varied consumption, making better use of the assets we own. But a nice phrase can hide a grim reality for those who depend on the new world of work for their livelihood. The insecurity of self-employment, the uncertainty of not knowing where or when the next paycheck will be coming from, and the pressure this places on those most in typical employment, whether it's the London taxi drivers threatened by Uber or call centre workers placed on zero-hour contracts. Millions of workers have been excluded from protections of formal employment contracts, And there's a relentless pressure placed upon those the majority still protected. It was the labour movement that wants shorter working days, health and safety at work and rights in the workplace. But technological change and the unfettered free market are tearing up the old work contract. Labour instead will offer a new contract for a new workforce. Security of income against uncertainty, the same rights and protections extended to all those at work. This is why the fight over tax credits matters so much to us. The tax credit system is well adapted to new forms of employment. Small businesses providing a useful service to the community rely upon tax credits, the whole system, to get them on their feet and smooth out their earnings. So we will defend and, where we can, improve the tax credit system. Self-employment at the moment offers few protections, so we all look to extend maternity and paternity rights to all self-employed workers. White van man and woman deserve just as much protection and recognition as white-collar workers. Let me conclude with this. Austerity is a political choice. It's not an economic necessity. Unless we change our political choices, the vast majority will be denied the opportunities that technological change presents. We can't afford to run a deficit with the future. Working with businesses, workers, universities, civil society organisations, governments today can and must seize the chance to change how we live and work, both now and in the future. We can break the stalemate and change course. A new economy where technology liberates rather than traps, where the fruits of scientific advance are shared by all, and where every one of us has the opportunity to develop our talents. A prosperous society built on sustainable growth and predicated on the values of fairness, equality and social justice. It's what I call socialism, but it's socialism with an iPad. Thank you very much.